Himadri Lahiri is a former professor in the Department of English and Cultural Studies, University of Burdwan, West Bengal. Currently, he is the professor of English at the School of Humanities, Netaji Subhash Open University, Kolkata. He has written extensively on diaspora studies and Indian English literature. His latest publication is Diaspora Theory and Transnationalism from Orient Black Swan, and Contemporary Indian English Poetry and Drama from Cambridge Scholars, and which is co-edited by him and also been published recently. So we welcome Himadri sir for the delivery of his lecture.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to be here, talking to you, talking amongst ourselves. And I'm really indebted to the Department of English for inviting me, and I'm very, very proud that I share this platform with Professor Samantak, whom I admire very much for his scholarship. And you know that this was indeed a very difficult day for me, in the sense that I had to wait for quite some time to enter this platform because of technical glitches. But then I see these technical glitches, this problem of technology, as a kind of a metaphor, of the contemporary times. As you know, it's not just because during this pandemic, we are meeting here on the internet, on this virtual platform, but you know that we have been here through this particular pathway, through this particular medium. But then in the meantime, what happens is that because of my trying to enter into the platform, I was a bit disoriented. And this is what, as you know, technology is capable of doing. Okay, it disorients you. It when not only at the personal level, when you see at the community level, you will find that how technology is capable of emptying ourselves of our own identities, in a sense. So this I take as a wonderful kind of a metaphor that we are facing here. Wonderful, the word wonderful has been used in an ironical sense. But then I want to begin from this point, and I feel I have some 25 minutes or something like that at my disposal to talk about the topic. Am I right?
Yes, sir.
So I will proceed. As you know, I'll be talking about postcolonialism now, a revaluation, but I will like to begin from this point because, as you know, technology. In the post-colonial scenario, we are bound to confront newer kind of situations, and I posit myself in the present moment. I posit myself in the period that we are facing today, the period of not only the pandemic situation, but also many other kinds of situations which help us reshape our personalities, which reshape us, which force us to think in newer ways. You know that the topic, the thrust area of today's discussion is this webinar is, of course, reimagining humanities. And this is the time which is very, very appropriate for reimagining this particular time and to reflect on how we can proceed today. I will focus on one particular strand, one particular theory, but the basic perspective will be the present moment from which we can look forward, okay, and look backward as well. Now, one point that the previous speaker, I was listening to Professor Shourid Bhattacharya. I joined midway. I couldn't listen to what the entire focus of his thesis was. But then this became very clear that he was talking about the role of the intellectual. So the role of the intellectual in the present moment, in the post-colonial time, has assumed a serious significance simply because that we have to think anew. We have to look forward and try to find out the ways in which we can disorient ourselves and reorient ourselves. So if you see if you look at the newspapers, daily newspapers, and the flood of news channels and other virtual media, you will find that not only the news, but also the fake news. And I have become acquainted with, familiar with this new word, fake news, new phrase, fake news, only very recently for about 2 or 3 years. But then this fake news has dealt with a severe challenge because it challenges the very concept of what we had known as truth, which is the true truth, which is the right news, which is the wrong news. So from that point of view, we have been forced in a kind of a situation where plethora of factors have begun to shape our life today. Now, in this kind of situation, the role I shall also take into consideration the role of the nation state as well. I shall come to that. I shall come to the basic theory of the post-colony. But then before that, I must mention that because of this new situation, we have been reduced to an Aadhaar number or a PAN number or a similar other kind of digital identities, which means that our identity as a human being becomes really you face a kind of a challenge to retain your identity as a human being. So it is not only a problem for us to retain our identity, to retain our individuality, but in the same way, it is also a kind of a challenge for the whole community to retain itself. And here the role of globalization and the role of the nation state is very, very important. So from that point of view, I feel this, I have already begun talking about the critical humanism, which I think has been dealt with by the earlier writers. Specifically, I heard Shaurit speaking about this to a certain extent. But critical humanism, as that your title also suggests like that, which is the focus now, I was going through an article written by Cato Manzo, and the title of the article is like this: Critical Humanism, Postcolonialism, and the Postmodern Ethics. This tries to pin down the title, the definition of critical humanism, and I'm reading out from the quotation in order to set the tone of my presentation today. I quote, "The critical humanism is an umbrella term for reflections on the nature of humanity that theorize what it means and how it is possible for interdependent beings to attain dignity, worth, and freedom." So you already come across the phrase interdependent beings, and that is what is being threatened here. So you are pinned down as an individual first, but then you are reduced to a statistical data, as part of a statistical data. Similarly, the community also as a whole being reduced to same kind of a statistical data. And now if you look at the hospitality, the hospitals and the industry that comes under the name, the hospitality industry. We can call together, call it like that today. You see that human beings have lost their dignity, and human beings have become just a matter of a number, and this number is being quoted at press conferences at the end of the day, and this adequately suggests the climax we have reached in the matter of disintegration of not only the self but also the community. Now, faced with such a kind of a situation, I would like to think about the post-colonialism from a humanitarian point of view, and we need to reorient our things, our thoughts in a humanitarian way, and integral with this perspective is the perspectives of ethics. So already I have mentioned, when I have mentioned critical humanism, I have already mentioned this dimension, this ethical dimension. We have talked about the interdependent beings, and we have also talked about dignity, worth, human worth, and freedom, which have been facing difficulties, challenges these days. And from that point of view, we need to refashion how we can redefine the idea of post-colonialism itself. Because, as you know, there has been talks about the death of post-colonialism from the end of 1980s, and specifically in the 1990s. There are critics like, as you know, Ella Shohat and Arif Dirlik, Sudesh Misro. They have talked about the death of post-colonialism. And Sudesh Misro has titled his essay, "What Was Post-Colonialism?" Then pushing post-colonialism as a historical fact that is no longer there in currency, but which is there to tap, for us to tap as a historical fact, as a historical philosophy. But then, as you know, this probably is not the case. How I see post-colonialism is that I feel that post-colonialism is a very energetic kind of discourse, interaction of discourses, internet of ideas, which can regenerate itself in newer ways. So I do not believe that post-colonialism has a shelf life, that it will die after the end of colonialism or after India or other countries have attained independence. I do not believe like that. So, because as you know, post-colonialism, actually colonialism continues in different shades, in different areas. I will talk about that later. Therefore, the need of post-colonialism is very much there. So what we need is to refashion our ideas, and the house is open, the idea is open, and you know that we have to rearrange the house in our own fashion. So we may differ in our opinions, but then we need to come to a kind of resolution, if I can use the term, about the ways, about whither post-colonialism is heading towards. When I say this, I obviously think that theories are not static. The theories move. Theories move through time. Theories move to spaces, and according to the conditions of the spaces, theories also refashion themselves. They take newer shapes, newer accents. So from that point of view, theories are traveling. And when I say that theories are traveling, theories always travel. I have obviously Edward Said's traveling theory and James Clifford's notes on travel and theory in mind. where they have talked about a point of departure and a kind of a travel, and in the process of the travel, the theories actually mutate and theories take new shapes. So mutation and adaptations are very important characteristic features of theories, and from that point of, I believe that postcolonialism is also a kind of a theory which is alive today, which is very much kicking today, and it is kicking even after colonialism, so-called colonialism, political colonialism has ended, and different kinds of colonialism has taken shape in newer forms. You see that postcolonialism over the decades have faced different kinds of challenges, different types of allegation and complaints about, there are many complaints about postcolonialism. I will mention some of these because from these comments we can have our own ways, we can look forward, we can have our destinations, we can set our destinations. So I will go into some comments which may be very much relevant today. Now you see that in our academic field, postcolonialism is very much alive. But what we do is that we usually go back to the origin of postcolonialism and how it developed, but we usually do not focus on how the ground reality is changing. We think of postcolonialism and the fathers, the theoretical fathers of postcolonialism, they not only emphasized the theoretical part, but they also talked about the praxis. But the praxis is actually disappearing, and in the academia, we have been captives of only theoretical musings. So there are many intellectuals, even in the academia, they talk about going beyond the academic discourses and going into the field, into the ground, where we can meet people and converse about the problems that they have been facing today. And therefore, the praxis is a very important area which we should retain, which we should retrace again after the periods of discursive practices, merely discursive practices. So it is because of the discursive practices that you see that Moore Gilbert probably talked about the suspicion of disciplinary exhaustion. Moore Gilbert is of the opinion, towards the end of his famous book actually, that as a discipline, probably we have reached the point of exhaustion. So from that point of view, we need to reinvigorate itself, and it is really reinvigorating itself. If you read Hamid Tabasi's writings, who has talked about the Arab Spring movement, you will find that subtitle of one of his books is The End of Postcolonialism. So he was thinking in terms of praxis. He was thinking that the population has risen up and they are struggling against the state forces, and therefore the bureaucracy, which is English educated, which is educated from who had their moorings in Western education, and many of them were actually educated in Western institutions and had Western orientations. Arab Spring was a moment when that kind of a connection with the West is going to sever. How much it was successful is a totally different matter, but then what is important for us is to think that this was a moment when Amit Dabasi actually thought that post-colonialism was really taking shape in a newer form. And therefore, the academic disciplinary exhaustion does not matter if we link it up with the larger social and political field. Arif Derlik, writing in 1994, points out that post-colonial critics have been silent on the relationship of the idea of post-colonialism to its context in contemporary capitalism. So what he introduces is the role of the capitalism, and this role of the capitalism is important in the sense that we need to focus on this because capitalism is very much active, operative in, as you know, globalization. So many of the critics who wrote in the 1980s and 1990s, they felt that post-colonialism has been replaced effectively by globalization. Is in fact, they in fact focus on the operation of the new economic formations and the coming of the multinationals in big way, and how they wrested the corporate sector, wrested power from the other conventional sources of power, like the political sources. They began to influence the polity as well through different means and through media as well. Media has been taken over by many corporate giants. So from that point of view, as you know, it also they felt the death knell of post-colonialism was hard. So the role of the globalization, the role of the capitalism was very much important, and therefore this became the focal point of many other writers who gradually moved to the political and the social fields, where the role of the marginalization of the common man, the marginalization of what we consider as the common human being, the destruction of the common human being was taking place through war and many other means. I will focus on E. San Juan Jr., who points out that metaphysics of textualism voids history of people's resistance to imperialism, liquidates popular memory, renounces responsibility for any ethical consequence of thought. So on the one hand, he talks about this, and on the other hand, he moves on to the greater field of reality, national, international reality, and where he suggests the lacuna of post-colonialism, where post-colonial critics have failed to address the relevant issues. I am quoting from San Juan, where were the post-colonial gurus during the Gulf War? What is their stand on the political prisoners languishing in US jails? How does post-colonial theory explain the plight of millions of overseas contract workers, women domestics, hospitality girls, the mail order brides, comprise this large, horizontally mobile cohort all over the world? So you see that already the word post-colonialism is, the meaning is being transcended. It is not only being confined to that political field where the question of overt political domination and military domination mattered. Okay, so the other categories of people, other categories of human beings, the other categories of subject people who were deprived of, who were robbed of their agency, you see all these people are brought together in the quotation. But what is important is that you also understand that Sanjuan is not limiting himself to the sphere of the nation state. He is already on the international field, transnational field. And in this way, he obviously suggests the efficacy of the new connotations of the term to be used in the present context. So the whether the nation state has withered at all is a different question altogether. Nation state has not withered. It is very much there, but in a different form. But I will come to that later on. But my point is that we have therefore moved away from the nation state, which was earlier the focus of post-colonial theory. There is a shift in the meaning, in the theory itself, there is a shift. So this shift ultimately broadens and embraces other categories. But here I would also like to point out that we basically we basically limit ourselves to the Western domination. I would also refer to the two other areas about which we get very little, precious little in terms of theory and in terms of literature. We know that literature is being produced from those areas, but those literary works are not in circulation because of the role of capitalism, which actually selects its own field of operation. Even when the colonial literature will be profitable, it will sell those things, publish those things and sell those things. But then I refer to two areas specifically. You know, the Chinese aggression in Tibet is one such point where colonialism took a new form. But not many of us in the form of theory or in the form of literary works focus on the area. And as you know, these days, the last few months, the role of China has become much more important, and all of us have been thinking in terms of Chinese aggression and how the Chinese aggression, whether it be in the field of pandemics or in the field of military aggression, how these things can be taken up. So from that point of, this is one area, and you know that there is another area which is Palestine. Israel has taken up a sizable part of the Palestine land and the way the hegemony is going on. So do we speak much about that in terms of theory? Probably we don't. Although there are many writings, especially written in the local languages, they are coming up, and there probably are a good number of musings over them, theoretical writings, which we cannot access properly, or some of us can access, others cannot. So from that point of, there is a lacuna in the overall post-colonial field, which we need to address now. You know that there are, I would like to mention 2 or 3 works, literary works, where you can, which you can look up for your own, if you have the interest. For example, you know that Sewang Yashe Pemba has written a wonderful book called White Crane, Lend Me Your Wings, a Tibetan tale of love and war. It speaks of the Chinese aggression. Okay, you have Shahar Khalifeh's Wild Thorns on the Situation. It is a novel originally written in Arabic, which is on the Palestinian situation. There are many other novels and other short stories there. So on such kind of situations, you know that we do not talk about these kind of writings. So from that point of view, we need to have a broader perspective of post-colonialism today. And when we talk about post-colonialism, Homi Bhabha has recently, some 5 or 6 months ago, given a talk it was actually arranged in memory of Toni Morrison, where he addressed the question of the refugees. And the problem of the refugees, specifically in the US and the Europe, is also bringing up, foregrounding the problems that the nation states are also facing. And there is deluge of refugee movement from the nation states to the first world countries in Europe and America. So what about these refugees problems? And Homi Bhabha thought that he speaks about the fact that they also need to be brought within the post-colonial ambit and thought in terms of hospitality, in the way Derrida talked about the unconditional hospitality. So you see that these are the situations, these are the ground realities when which forces us to take a new stand, and this new stand cannot be anything but ethical. This new stand will be the critical humanist kind of a stand, where the question of the ethics of hospitality must be addressed, and the ethics of refuge, freedom, and human rights must be addressed. And we must go beyond the binary of racial colonial categories in terms of morality and ethical dimension. We cannot see them just from the conventional political or social perspective. So this solution of, I do not know how much time I have, probably I have 5 minutes or so. Can somebody give me some idea about how much time I have? So you see that in such kind of a situation, we must think in terms of a transnational movement, transnational ideas that post-colonialism must embrace. So, and when I talk about this, I think that the post-colonial discourses should flow towards two directions. But when I say two directions, I do not mean that they are not interconnected. They are, of course, interconnected. What I mean by two directions is that there is a global scenario which must be addressed. This global scenario includes the role of the transnational corporate sector, corporate houses, and the way the big nation states actually not only manipulate capital, but also human capital, human beings, and reduce human beings to data, to mere data. So this is one aspect which we need to talk about. But there is another aspect which is equally very, very important. And this aspect is the aspect of the post-colonial. I will come to this, I will dwell on this aspect for some minute before I finish. I assume that I have 5 minutes or so. If you can help me.
Sir, you can go ahead. You have 5 minutes.
Okay. So I I think that from the moral moorings, from the ethical moorings, from the point of view of refuge, freedom, human rights, we must move towards these two directions which are very much interconnected. Now, I'm not going to talk much about the globalization and the role of the capital, the role of, because that has been much talked about, and I have also referred to those. But I would like to dwell for some minutes on the concept of the post-colony and the way our post-colonialism, our thoughts about post-colonialism can be given some kind of a shape in the context of the present moment. You see that Simon Gikande, who is a very important post-colonial critic, he made a comment in the 1980s. He says even the die-hard nationalists were finding it hard to argue that the nation state was the guarantor of economic freedom or cultural affirmation. The nation state, once deemed to be defender of post-colonial subjects, was now conceived as the major threat to the well-being of its citizens. So he long ago in the 1980s thought about this problem, about the citizenry, the problems that today the citizenry would face today when the data and the disintegration of the subjective narrator, the subjective person, the narrator, speaker, and the community narrator will face one day. So that was, he had the foresight, and he also said, I'm sorry, I would go to Akhil Membe. I'm not sure whether I pronounce his name properly, but he is a very important critic of post-colonialism. And what is interesting is that this African critic talks about the name of one of his books is On the Post-Colony. And this has focused on the African scenario mainly, but which is also applicable to other states, other nation states, where the concept of the post-colony can be applied. He talks about the despicable condition of the human beings under the new political regime and in the so-called free African countries, or for that matter, in other Asian and other countries. So I will talk about Akhil Membe. He defines the notion of post-colonialism, and I will quote from him and how he characterizes post-colonialism or post-colony is what is important to my mind, and therefore I will spend the next 3-4 minutes on him. I quote, "The notion of post-colony identifies specifically a given historical trajectory, that of societies recently emerging from the experience of colonization and the violence which the colonial relationship par excellence involves," unquote. So this is the context of his theory, which he places in the context of newly emerged and emerging countries. And then he goes on to say, the post-colony is characterized by a distinctive style of political mobilization, by a tendency to excess and a lack of proportion. But the post-colony is also made up of a series of corporate institutions and a political machinery which, once they are in place, constitute a distinctive regime of violence. In this sense, the post-colony is a particularly revealing and rather dramatic stage on which are played the wider problems of subjection and its corollary, discipline, unquote. So in a very clear-cut way, he has pointed out the role of the international corporate sectors, transnational corporate sectors, which works in tandem with the new political regimes in the new nation states after they get political freedom. So it undoes all the efforts of the foundational critics who talked in terms of humanism, who talked in terms of wresting the freedom from political domination. And therefore, it is a kind of collapse of the major premises of the foundational thinkers of post-colonialism. So from that point of view, a new stage, we have entered into a new stage, and where the state power works in collusion with the international, not only bodies like International Monetary Fund and the UNO, but also other bodies. So I will just take 1 or 2 minutes. In a post-colony, he says, state power creates through its administrative and bureaucratic practices. This is also very interesting, and the kind of the data that are data methods of introducing data cards, like other cards or other things. These are all part of the scheme. And he says a world of meaning of its own, through its administrative and bureaucratic practices, the post-colony creates a world of meaning of its own, a master code which, in the power of becoming the society's primary central code, attempts to institutionalize its world of meanings as a socio-historical world, and to make that world fully real, turning it into a part of people's common sense, not only by instilling it in the mind of the people or target population, but also by integrating into the consciousness of the period. So he has given us a description in which the new hegemonic power has taken hold of our lives, and what we are seeing in the present regimes, political regimes of violence in the states of Asia or Africa or in South America is nothing but a new reality, a kind of a reality which we must address in our discourses of post-colonialism. So post-colonialism is waiting for its new prophets. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. We are going to take the questions later. We will go to the second speaker. I would like to introduce Professor Samantak. Professor Das is a professor of comparative literature and director of the School of Culture Studies, Cultural Texts and Records, Jadavpur University. He is also the director of the university's Internal Quality Assurance Cell. Sir has written and lectured on 19th century literature, translation, the relationships between the biological sciences and literature, environment, ecology, rural development and education in journals, magazines and newspapers in India and abroad, including the Times, Higher Education Supplement, Economic and Political Weekly, Interventions, International Journal of Postcolonial Studies, the Times of India, the Statesman, the Telegraph, the Indian Express, the Hindu, Biblio, among others. He has led and jointly led several national and international projects, including language learning, digitizing ephemera, creating databases, and so on. We welcome you, sir. The topic of sir's lecture is Lies, Damned Lies, and COVID-19, Reflections on Literature and Culture at a Time of Pandemic. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much indeed. It should be apparent by now that I spend a great deal of my time either discussing lies or lying, because, as director of the IQAC, I am supposed to tell believable lies to rating agencies. And as somebody who's been a student of literature for longer than most of you have existed on this earth, I suspect, I basically deal with lies. Because fiction is a form of lying, and I'll come to that in a minute. But let me begin by reading out from a text. And then, well, if this was in a regular seminar or conference, I would ask you to guess the text, but I suspect some of you will be able to guess it. So here goes. Dash was in hospital during the last weeks of Lent and Easter week. When convalescing, he remembered the dreams he had had while running a high temperature and in delirium. He dreamt that the whole world was ravaged by an unknown and terrible plague that had spread across Europe from the depths of Asia. All except a few chosen ones were doomed to perish. New kinds of germs, microscopic creatures which lodged in the bodies of men, made their appearance. But these creatures were spirits endowed with reason and will. People who became infected with them at once became mad and violent. But never had people considered themselves as wise and as strong in their pursuit of truth as these plague-ridden people. Never had they thought their decisions, their scientific conclusions, and their moral convictions so unshakable, or so incontestably right. Whole villages, whole towns, and peoples became infected and went mad. They were in a state of constant alarm. They did not understand each other. Each of them believed that the truth only resided in him, and was miserable looking at the others, and smote his breast, wept, and wrung his hands. They did not know whom to put on trial or how to pass judgment. They could not agree what was good or what was evil. They did not know whom to accuse or whom to acquit. Men killed each other in a kind of senseless fury. They raised their armies against each other, but these armies, when already on the march, began suddenly to fight among themselves. Their ranks broke, and the soldiers fell upon one another, bayoneted and stabbed each other, bit and devoured each other. In the cities, the tocsin was sounded all day long. They called everyone together, but no one knew who had summoned them or why they had been summoned, and all were in a state of great alarm. The most ordinary trades were abandoned because everyone was propounding his own theories, offering his own solutions, and they could not agree. They gave up tilling the ground. Here and there, people gathered in crowds, adopted some decision, and vowed not to part. But they immediately started doing something else, something quite different from what they had decided. And they began to accuse each other, fought and killed each other. Fires broke out, famine spread, wholesale destruction stalked the earth. The pestilence grew and spread farther afield. Only a few people could save themselves in the whole world. Those were the pure and chosen ones, destined to start a new race of men and a new life, to renew and purify the earth. But no one had ever seen these people. No one had heard their words or their voices. Now that excerpt that I read out to you is from a book that's 154 years old. Many of you will have heard of it. It's called Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky, this book. And I read out the lesser known translation, not the Constance Garnett translation, but the David Magerschak translation, which is published in Penguin Classics. And the reason why I read that out is twofold. The first reason is that plague, or the threat of plague, or that of wholesale destruction, is something that has, in a sense, haunted literature in various parts of the world for several centuries. So in a sense, what we are seeing now, the responses that we are seeing to the SARS pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, if you like, is not new. But at the same time, the responses carry with them the whiff of inaccuracy or lies. And I'm glad that Himadri has brought up this entire business of fake news, of people lying. And with that quotation to begin with, let me just ask a few relatively simple questions and point you in a few directions regarding lies and lying. So let me begin with the Buddha. As you know, right thought, which is absolutely fundamental to Buddhist philosophy, includes the exhortation not to lie, or not to lie deliberately. But there is also a story which is part of the Buddha legend, or whatever you want, which goes something like this. Once the Buddha was meditating whilst walking, which is a particular form of meditation practiced even now by Buddhists. And he was walking in the forest when he perceived with his all-seeing eye an incident about to occur. So he can, the all-seeing eye can see into the future as well. And he thought how he should respond to it. And a few minutes later, a terrified-looking man ran past him. And then the Buddha calmly stepped a few feet to his left and waited. Soon enough, a gang of shaitans, dacoits, approached him and asked, "While standing there, did you see a man run past?" And the Buddha replied, "No." He was, of course, telling the truth, because he had been standing somewhere else when he saw the man run past. In the Arthashastra, Kautilya's, Chanakya Kautilya's, one of the ways in which you test the loyalty of a potential courtier is to tell lies to that courtier about the king or the ruler and gauge him in terms of his or her, I suppose, responses. The same can be done when women are being considered for inclusion as courtesans for the ruler. Yes, of course, it's a sexist and patriarchal text, but the point that I'm trying to make about lying is that lying can be used in ancient Indian philosophy. So there's a gap of about 700-800 years between the alleged incident in the Buddha's life and the Arthashastra. But in both of them, you can see that there is space given for tactical lying, if you like. In fact, in the Buddha's case, of course, the whole notion of what a lie is questioned. If we turn to the West, we will see that the great debate that took place between Plato and of how useful or how good is a lie for acquiring knowledge. You remember the banishment of the poets because they were imitators. And then Aristotle comes up with this notion of art as being an imitation which, instead of taking you further away from the truth, takes you closer to the truth. An imitation for the Greeks, of course, as we know, who believed in the Platonic theory of perfect forms, was a species of lie. In the Christian tradition, for example, in St. Augustine, and I'm jumping roughly, I think, about a little after Aristotle, he spoke about several kinds of lies. In fact, 8 kinds of lies, And these had to do with quick listing: lies having to do with spiritual or religious teaching, lies that harm others and help no one, lies that can harm others but help someone, lies that are told for the pleasure of lying. And he notes, as did the Romantics, that imitation, his only, as if his only vocation were endless imitation. Imitation is, of course, a species, if you like, of lie, certain kinds of imitation. So pleasure of lying, lies told to please others in smooth discourse, lies that harm no one and that help someone, harm, and that help can be either material help or spiritual help, and lies which are told in order not to harm someone and to protect someone else from harm. Now, what we see here is that within the Buddhist tradition, within the sort of broad Indian tradition, as well as within the Western tradition extending from Plato right up to the early Christian fathers, lies have been pretty contentious. One is told that one should not lie, but of course, one of the fundamental, how shall I put it, characteristics of being human is being able to lie. And I think it is necessary for any student of literature, such as myself, to try and understand what a lie is, and then to try and relate it to what happens to this unique human faculty. Because as far as we know, other animals don't lie. They might set traps and so on, but they're not liars. It has been speculated that only the human animal is able to lie. Darwin had things to say about it, and he spoke of the faculty of imagination as necessarily involving this element of not telling the truth, which may not be the same thing as telling a lie. In common discourse, we think of lies as a sort of deliberate untruth. When you know something to be true and you say something which that is not, and you often have to pay the price. Our stories, our folk tales are littered with examples of liars. The boy crying wolf being perhaps the most famous and also a fairly universal example, that if you tell the same lie over and over again, people won't believe you, and when it does become true, then you're going to be abandoned by your friends, as happened to this poor chap who got eaten up by the wolves or the bears, depending on which version of the folktale or story that you look at. So what I read out in the beginning can be seen as a species of lie. This is Dostoevsky imagining a plague caused by microbes or tiny organisms, depending on which translation you read, and Constance Garnett translates it as, I think, microcosmic organisms, and this is as tiny organisms and so on and so forth, which come, interestingly enough, from Asia, infect those in the West, in Europe, and lay scourge to the world. We might also here recall that of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, one was pestilence, not just war and death and famine, but pestilence as well. And pestilence, as we know, is a word synonymous with the plague. Now, to me, one of the most interesting things that has happened as a result of this global pandemic is that so many of the fissures and breaks and divisions that existed already are becoming exacerbated. So our biases against those who are not like us, those who are poorer than us, those who don't follow the same religion, and so on and so forth, they are coming up. And so in fiction, if we look at the fiction that has to do with pestilence. The great Journal of the Plague Year is not really fiction, it's a journal, Defoe's 1667, so 200 years before Dostoevsky, roughly. He talks about how people started lying. And there are many other novels about the plague. One of the things that you notice in Camus' La Peste, which is typically translated as the plague, is, and notice pestilence, is about people lying. But what about the nature of the lies that take place in a situation of crisis? I wish to draw your attention to a Bangla novel published a couple of years ago and only very recently translated into English. This is a novel by Ashok Kumar Mukhopadhyay called Abhiram Jorer Rupkatha, which has been translated by Arunabha Sinha as a ballad of remittent fever, although I would probably have called it a tale of unremitting fever. Never mind. It covers a span of a little over 100 years and speaks of the lives of a family of quite heroic doctors in the Ghoshals in Kolkata, who fight at various times different kinds of plague-like scourges that lay waste to the city, whether it is malaria or typhoid. And it covers the period roughly from the last quarter of the 19th century to the third quarter of the 20th, when exciting new discoveries were being made in the treatment and control of disease, including especially waterborne diseases. This was also the time when public health and sanitation becomes a very important aspect for discussion and for taking decisions at the social, political, and of course, individual level. Now, so therefore, we've got fiction as a species of lie, and yet, strangely, in an almost kind of Aristotelian way, I cannot help but think that such fiction might actually be looking at phenomena, in this case, the phenomenon of a pandemic, from a perspective which, when it was created, was a lie, but in sort of prophetic, proleptic fashion, almost seems to come true later on. Funny little story, personal story. When I was looking at the earliest responses to the virus, including especially President Trump's insistence on calling it the Chinese virus, and articles that were appearing there, talking about, how awful the Chinese were, before it switched over to talking about a conspiracy, and I'll come to conspiracy theories in a moment. I was reminded of this section in Crime and Punishment, so I went and sort of dug it up, because it had left a very vivid impression on my mind when I had first read it some 35 years ago. For the simple reason that I was also looking at the plague at that time, because I was preparing for a course. No, it couldn't have been 35 years ago, about 26, 27 years ago, because I was looking at both texts for a course on European fiction that was offered at the place that I used to work in then, Vishwabharati. So plague, death, and all of that was sort of going through my head. And sure enough, I found the passage. Took me a bit of time. I was kind of under the impression it was a little earlier than it is in the novel. This occurs, incidentally, if you want to read it up, right at the end of sort of peace and reconciliation, when Dostoevsky ends by saying, "And I will tell you about a man and how he recovered and became good, and with Sonia and so on." And but that is the stuff of another story. Yeah, that's how he ends. But that is the beginning of a new story, the story of the gradual rebirth of a man, the story of his gradual regeneration. and so on, and so on and so forth. But anyway, I was reminded of it, and sure enough, one of the characteristics of any pandemic, any disease that spreads, is the very human desire to search for origins. And the origin is usually, and this is where I think it ties up with what Himadri was talking about a while ago, the origin is usually located somewhere else, usually in the mysterious east or the darkest part of Africa. You remember the chaos and the scandal that was created after Ebola broke out, and immediately notions of dirty Africans spreading it and so on and so forth came up. And here, of course, it is the quote-unquote barbaric, uncivilized Chinese who have nothing better to do than eat anything that, anything on legs that's not a table, that they are the ones who are spreading it. And there are therefore a lot of similarities in the way in which people, the ways in which people respond to pandemics. And and this we can look at a later text later from the ones I've mentioned before, about 40 years earlier than Dostoevsky's, The Betrothed. This is the novel about an outbreak of plague written by the Italian writer Alessandro Manzoni, and he talks about the anger, the official response to the plague that took place in 1630. In fact, if you look at European literature from the oldest times to well into the 19th and probably early into the 20th century as well. Well, if you look at Camus, but that's a very problematic text for me, so I won't talk about it. But this outbreak, sudden outbreak of a disease whose origins are not really known and whose cure is not identifiable, forms the background to so many texts, so many novels that we talk about, that we read about. We know that in Shakespeare's time, for example, the theaters will be closed every year because there will be a regular outbreak of plague, and so on and so forth. And so the responses that happens, I will just quickly note them one by one. So the first has been to create rumors and spread false information. Hang on, why am I getting little blinks on this? Anyway, I'll just continue. There are stories in Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year and in Manzoni's The Betrothed. People maintaining a distance from each other because they were afraid of contracting the plague, and yet seeking the latest gossip that their neighbors could give them. And plague, as is true for the COVID-19 pandemic, as I mentioned earlier, is something which is invariably seen as cognate with evil or the result of some kind of sin, and therefore something that comes from outside. Now, I don't wish to redraw your attention to the ways in which the Tablighi gathering was then being used by certain political formations in India to speak of the plague as a Muslim disease or deliberately spread by Muslims. There is also in our times assignment of death and disease to certain classes. So in terms of class, interestingly enough, the COVID-19 pandemic is seen as having been spread by the wealthier classes. So it's the disease that was brought into Kolkata, so the story goes, by the privileged upper middle class son of a bureaucrat and a teacher, I think, who was studying in London and came here and deliberately spread the disease. It is associated more with the sort who fly in aeroplanes rather than those who use more plebeian and mundane forms of transport. The second thing that I want to talk about is that the birth of such a horrifying disease or diseases is usually seen as deliberate. You remember the way in which the plague, not the plague, the pestilence, if you like, the pandemic, if you like, has. There are still people now, and I don't know whether any of you falls within that group, which is firmly convinced that it's the result of a planned conspiracy by the Chinese to take over the global economy, and that the novel coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2, is actually created in a laboratory, despite a ton of scientific evidence which says that it isn't. And I do not know whether, like you have received WhatsApp forwards claiming that a certain Japanese Nobel Prize winner had gone on record saying that it's created in a laboratory. Of course, he'd done absolutely nothing of that kind. But you tend to look at pestilence as something that comes from outside, something that is foreign, and something that is deliberately planted in order to cause death and destruction amongst the native populace, however you define that native populace. For example, Marcus Aurelius blamed Christians for the smallpox plague because they had not joined the rituals to propitiate the Roman gods. And in subsequent plagues in Europe, Jews were very often held up as the cause of the plague because they were dirty and filthy and so on and so forth. The unfounded rumors and accusations, strangely unscientific, also lead to the birth of new self-declared heroes and heroines who take upon themselves the task of explaining the plague to someone. That's the third thing I want to talk about. And finally, and I promise you I won't take up much time. I was asked to speak for 20 minutes and I shall stick to my time schedule. We are already as it is. And the fourth thing that I want to talk about is how people respond to it. So first, a plague or pestilence, pandemic is seen as coming from outside, usually from a foreigner, some kind of other. It's an other disease, other with a capital O. Two, it is very often seen as a deliberate act or brought about as a result of certain actions performed or not performed by these foreign groups. So the Christians not worshipping the Roman gods, causing an outbreak of smallpox, the Jews, by definition dirty and so on and so forth, causing outbreaks of cholera and typhoid and so on and so forth. And I want to come now to the self-declared explainers of such incidents. Now, I had a longish section where I wanted to discuss a 26-minute, if I remember, yeah, I've got it out, film called Plandemic. I don't know how much of you have seen it, but it's received several million views. It's actually 25 minutes, 17 seconds long. The internet gives you everything. And it features a doctor, Judy Mikovits, and she very calmly and apparently in a scientific way explains how the pandemic is a lab-created organism. The novel coronavirus is a lab-created organism, which has been not only released by the Chinese, but done so with the active connivance of Dr. Tony Fauci, who is the primary villain, in a sense, in this piece. She also advocates that the wearing of masks can, in fact, increase infection and so on and so forth. It's just so horribly unscientific that even when I was watching it the very first time, and it was forwarded to me by some kindly soul, I think the day it was uploaded on YouTube, I was absolutely horrified as to the kinds of things that this woman, who's allegedly a scientist, albeit a discredited one, was spreading. I needn't say much more about it. There are a lot of videos, articles, and in fact, I think an entire New York Times piece, which takes us step by step through Plandemic, P-L-A-N-D-E-M-I-C, portmanteau word, planned pandemic, showing you how wrong and how terrible the whole thing is. And there, of course, are others, both within our country and elsewhere, perhaps not so well known, who are providing, proof and knowledge of the origins of this pandemic. And more interestingly, offering various kinds of cures, various kinds of protection, and various kinds of predictions about when it will come to an end. I remember there's some young chap, very sweet-looking young boy who had confidently predicted, I think, the 16th of May as the day when it would go away or start going away. Our Prime Minister himself spoke of how the Kurukshetra war had taken place over just 18 days, and so we would defeat this pandemic in 21 days. And I needn't go into all the things that many of us have done, beating pans and pots and lighting lamps and turning off electrical lights and so on and so forth, all in an effort to beat this pestilence, if you like. I want to come now to the last sort of thing that I have to say about this this phenomenon and the literary and cultural responses to it, which is not which let me put it as schematically as possible. It often seems to us, to many of us, that the task of the public intellectual or the task of the writer of fiction or otherwise will be to uphold and champion the scientific ways of understanding, combating, and eventually, quote unquote, defeating the plague. Now, I don't agree with all of this. And the thing that I most disagree with is the rhetoric of war that is being, touted everywhere, spouted everywhere, whilst talking of this pandemic. Doctors and nurses are frontline warriors. We are engaged in a battle with it, and so on and so forth. And I don't have any problems with the rhetoric, but let us remind ourselves that what is likely to happen is not that this will go away, or not that this will be a vanquished enemy, like smallpox stored in some vials somewhere, but it's something that we will simply have to learn to live with, as we have learned to live with acquired immunodeficiency disease, malaria, typhoid, which is still there, tuberculosis, which kills more people than most other diseases even now. So we will learn to live with it, possibly a vaccine, maybe a vaccine of which we will have to take booster doses later on, and so on and so forth. And it is perhaps this sort of reality check that all creators, cultural activists, and intellectuals, public or otherwise, are supposed to do. And I don't have a great deal of argument about it. However, I do feel that there are three things that seem to be happening now gradually, and I could perhaps later send you links to some of these pieces and performances and so on, that the business of those of us who are in the business of communicating with others could do, which is not to write scientific articles, because most of us aren't trained to do that, nor to send out sort of watered down versions of scientific knowledge and so on and so forth, because that is changing. In fact, that is one of the more interesting things about COVID-19. If you look at the way in which, let's say, the World Health Organization or governments have responded to it, you will see that the scientific consensus has changed from time to time. Initially, if you recall, people were told, well, wearing masks is not really such a big deal. And now wearing masks has become virtually mandatory and a bone of contention, let's say, for example, amongst libertarians in the United States of America. In India, fortunately, most people seem to have accepted the fact that masks need to be worn. Where social distancing is concerned, again, if I wear a mask, do I need to socially distance or not? Still being debated, although I don't think it's a matter of debate. And the washing of hands and the use of sanitizers and so on, all of these things. But if you notice, the attitudes are changing, as well as predictions about when this is likely to be brought under some kind of control. I'm not saying defeated, but brought under some kind of control. And the most heinous example of the way in which those in power are playing with us has to do with the University Grants Commission, which had initially said, well, we leave it up to universities to conduct or not conduct examinations, and now they have made it mandatory to conduct exams in September, a month which is very likely to see the highest number of cases recorded and, unfortunately, the highest number of deaths, however small the percentage may be, recorded in India. And as you know, that's being challenged in the Supreme Court, and a lot of state governments have said they won't abide by it. Some universities, like Presidency in Kolkata, have brought out final results and so on and so forth. And this is having a terrible, terrible toll on the mental health, especially of young people, but also in many instances on their friends and parents and so on and so forth. Now, this hubris, and I'm deliberately using that word, this hubris, which either enables you to accurately identify the origin or the end of the disease and how best to go about killing it, defeating it, is something that I think we need to warn ourselves against. The simple fact of the matter is that although we know a great deal more about this coronavirus now than we did a month or even a fortnight earlier, we don't know enough to make accurate predictions. And if you look at the places where this has been dealt with or is being dealt with, why should I use the past tense, sensibly, places like New Zealand, Germany, and the Indian state of Kerala, you will see one thing that shines through, which is honest communication between those who are at the helm of government and those who are the governed. So the governors and the governed are communicating with each other, and it is a cooperative enterprise. Something that Himadri mentioned about transnational capitalism and so on and so forth resonated very powerfully with me, because it seems to me that this is one sickness, I'm using the word deliberately, that cannot be defeated by some sort of great heroic captain standing at the helm and telling us what to do. It can, I think, be brought under control if we all cooperate in this. And instead of laying down the law by fiat, especially on helpless, unsuspecting groups of people, whether those are migrant workers or students, we need to start cooperating with each other. Let me end by reading out the final sentence of an essay that was published in the New York Times. I'll just check the date here. Hang on. Some time back, after the plague, of course, on the 23rd of April, so three months and a bit ago, by Orhan Pamuk, and it's called What the Great Pandemic Novels Teach Us. And this is the way in which Pamuk, undoubtedly one of the greatest living writers in the world today, ends. And he says this: for a better world to emerge after this pandemic, we must embrace and nourish the feelings of humility and solidarity engendered by the current moment. Unfortunately, instead of humility, we find all too often, especially amongst our leaders, hubris, and instead of solidarity, divisiveness being practiced not just by our political leaders, but by those in charge of our institutions, and indeed the residents' welfare associations spread across the country. So we have got hubris and divisiveness instead of humility and solidarity. And the sooner that we all work together to overcome this, the better it will be, not for us, not just now, but in the near and not so distant future. Thank you very much. That's it. I've ended.
Thank you, Samantak. Thank you so much. I request Professor Mukherjee to go ahead with the discussions. Paramita, can you hear me? Are you there? Paramita, can you hear me? I think there must be some technical glitch on her end. So, sir, now I'll just step in for Dr. Mukherjee and go ahead with the question answer sessions. I'm picking up this question. This is for Professor Lahiri. So, I'm picking up this question from the chat box. Somebody has put in, this person is a guest whose name is not clear to me. He or she has mentioned post-colonial issues vary from regions to regions, I think, because this is sort of a observation the person is sharing from regions to regions, I think, because I've been carried out in field research in Africa. I'm a kind of Africanist. So the definitions, the case studies like post, pre-colonial issues are different from country to country. Are there any specific cases or issues on the focusing in Indian cases in particular?
A very good question, actually. When I said that post-colonialism needs to be reoriented, I didn't mean that it should be addressed uniformly. Because as you know, as you rightly pointed out, it's also region-specific. And especially critics and writers in Africa, they have pointed out that the issues may be different in different areas, in different countries, in different nation states. So you are absolutely correct that it cannot be uniformly addressed. It cannot be uniformly homogenized. There is no question of that, because the problems that we face in India may not be the same in Africa or South America. So obviously, we must respond to the local situations as well. And that is why some post-colonial critics also bring in the question of postmodernism, which believes in different centers, and they say that because of the interference or intervention of capitalism, there is no one single center, and there are many centers from which one can move to another. One train can move to another center, another point. You see that even globalization does not speak of one point of origin. Similarly, the kind of influence or impact the capitalism will have on a particular region may be different depending on the ground conditions, depending on how the subject respond to the interferences and interventions. So obviously you are absolutely right.
Thank you, sir. I myself actually have a question for Professor Dash. If I might go ahead and ask, this is, I mean, it's just a query, not even, I don't think it's, situations like the kind we are living through right now. Am I audible?
Yeah, you are.
Okay, we are living through right now, and given the fact that these are untold of kind of moments, you know, we have never, I mean, we have never sat at home and taught, we have never sat at home and communicated like this, having my child at home running around while I'm trying to do this, he having his schools at home, everything in a jeopardy. And this is, I'm just talking from my own context. There are so many people going through various kinds of experiences on a daily basis, which is completely new to us. So do you think, other than just being conscious enough and saying that, yes, this is a moment when, you know, lies are on the surge and we can't help it, but this has become a part of our lives, can we, do you think this is a sort of a defense mechanism on our part to survive and sort of deal with these unsettling moments? Or I don't know, I mean, this is just an observation on my part. I mean, is this coming to us naturally, and is it so that we cannot help it, but spontaneously, maybe certain moments in certain situations we know, we can sense that maybe this is a lie, what the news is serving me, what somebody else is telling me, but maybe there's a part of me, a percentage of my intellect, which is forcing me or telling me, okay, I would choose to believe it for a moment, maybe because it is giving me an escape, maybe. So I don't know, what are your observations on that?
Well, you know, couple of things. First of all, you know, one of the things that has happened as a result of this pandemic, which I did not want to discuss because that's a whole new discussion, is it has completely messed up our notions of time. All of us here have lived essentially with a kind of notion of time as linear and somehow progressive, or at least that's the sort of Protestant work ethic, you know, work for yourself and things will improve, a kind of linearity with which we've grown up. So, you know, you do well in school, so then you get into a good university, then you do well in university, you get a good job, blah, 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 all of that. Now, this notion of temporality has been completely thrown out of gear as a result of this pandemic. We don't know when we can resume quote unquote regular classes. We don't know what these regular classes will be. We don't know what the new normal will be. And it is very normal and natural for us to clutch at straws. Several months ago, I had made the suggestion that all educational institutions in India should go in for a 0 year. That is to say, a year in which we work and in which we engage with each other, students with teachers and teachers with students, but one in which no exams are held. And so somebody who would have graduated in July 2020 will now graduate in July 2021. All board exams scheduled for 2020 would be held in, or, you know, partially completed in 2020 would be completed in 2021. 2021 exams held in 2022. And of course, I was laughed out of court. Everybody said, you know, that's Samantak being mad and unnecessarily provocative again. But I meant it absolutely seriously. And whether you like it or not, Ronita, we have already lost a full semester. We've lost half the previous semester, and we are well on the way to losing the present semester. You know, as is obvious, even those institutions such as, I believe yours, which has held online classes, nobody I know is satisfied with online classes. I mean, we are not satisfied with this online meeting, right? No sensible person is satisfied with online classes, except, I suppose, those who get paid for making software for conducting. So, and it's affecting us in homes. You know, as a mother, you know that you're having to juggle so many different things, your child and your work. And the separation that we had gotten used to using to our own advantage, that this is home, this is where I do certain things, this is work, this is where I do certain other things, you know, dividing our, that has completely gone for us. Timings have become strange. You know, can you imagine doing a conference at 8:15 at night? It wouldn't happen. This is the time when we would preferably be having cocktails or, chatting with each other after the day's sessions are over. This business of talking to people whom I can't see is bizarre. This is about the fifth or the sixth time that I'm doing it. I have no idea how people are responding to me. I can't see your bodies. I can't see your faces. I don't know whether you are, at all listening to me or not. And I suspect most of you aren't. It's because I'm an egotistical swine that I can just keep talking to a blank stage. I know that. But yeah, this has happened, and therefore these are the reasons why all of us need to accept that fact that none of us is psychologically stable at this moment. The extent of our instability will vary. Some of us may be managing to carry on all right, and many of us are not being able to carry on. And unfortunately, what I fear is once we come back to the new normal, whenever and whatever that is, we will have to deal with a huge number of psychological problems in the population as a whole. And that, I think, offers hope to those who are creators of cultural artifacts, of music, of dance, of theater, of drama. And that's where our roles as alleged teachers will become profoundly important. Sorry for that very long answer to your simple question.
Thank you so much. So I think Dr. Mukherjee has joined us. So I'll just request ma'am to take over and close the discussions for the day. We are already running quite late. So ma'am, over to you.
Can't hear.
Sorry, you're not audible. You're not audible.
We have already made you stay here longer than you are supposed to. So thank you so much. And we are so glad that you could make time. So we look forward to more such interactions and